When it comes to skyrocketing prices, falling currencies, and political instability, Turkey is likely to surface soon. On paper, this is a country whose economy should have plunged into a deep crisis long ago, but in fact, it's growing. And sometimes at a pace that not every developed country is capable of. How is this even possible? Why is Turkey's economy still afloat despite record inflation and an unstable currency? What is really behind this seemingly illogical growth? Let's get this straight. On Wednesday, March 19th, 2025, the trading session on the Istanbul Stock Exchange began with a fall. The main index lost 9% right from the opening, and by the end of the week by the same amount. On the same morning, the Turkish lira sharply weakened against the dollar by 12% in a few hours. By evening, the situation had leveled off slightly, but still the drop was almost 4%. The panic was slightly dampened. The Central Bank of Turkey urgently raised the one-day loan rate by 2 percentage points at once to 46% per annum. A month later, on April 17th, he raised the key rate, the weekly repo, to this level. At the same time, until recently, the rate decreased against the background of slowing inflation. By spring, it had dropped to 38% per annum, which is almost a historical minimum for Turkey in recent years. But the reason for what was happening was not economic, but political. The arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, the main rival of the current president, Erdogan. This sparked mass protests, to which the authorities responded with water cannons and tear gas. International investors took this as a serious signal and began hastily withdrawing money from the country. The central bank had to intervene urgently. In 3 weeks after the arrest, the foreigners sold Turkish bonds worth more than $7.5 billion. To stabilize the markets, the central bank spent about $30 billion in foreign exchange reserves. The opposition accused the central bank of draining taxpayers' money at the behest of the president. And Erdogan himself, in turn, promised that he would not allow anyone to jeopardize the country's economic achievements. In general, this is nothing new for Turkey: political tension, instability, and sudden moves by regulators. But what is more interesting is what kind of economic successes is Erdogan talking about? Where did they come from, and at what cost? If someone had said 100 years ago in 1923 that Turkey would enter the top 20 largest economies in the world, few people would have believed it. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the loss of territories, the country's economy was in a very difficult state: weak industry, poor population, primitive agriculture. The government tried to support private business and attract investment, but the country remained agrarian. By the end of the 1920s, agriculture accounted for more than 80% of all exports. The industry was just emerging, mainly due to import duties, but all this happened from a very low base. At that time, the country's financial system was controlled mainly by foreigners. The largest loans were issued by Western banks, and some of them even printed their own money. Everything started to change with the Great Depression of 1929. Foreign investment has declined sharply, and Turkey has shifted to a more centralized economy model with a nationalist bent and strong protection of the domestic market. In 1930, the country's central bank was founded, and Turkey regained control of monetary policy. Railways, ports, mines, everything that mattered was nationalized. Large-scale industry was created exclusively by the state. The private sector is left with trade, services, and agriculture. But even such measures did not lead to rapid growth. The outbreak of the Second World War seriously affected the economy. Although Turkey practically did not participate in it, all foreign economic relations were disrupted. After the war, the country changed course again. Now its currency was pegged to the dollar, and the economy was market-oriented. But this did not save them from instability. On the contrary, since then, a serious crisis has occurred about once every 10 years, often involving military coups, as was the case in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Every time, history repeated itself: active economic growth, government spending growth, overheating and foreign trade deficit, another crisis. After that, austerity measures were introduced to curb imports and pay off foreign creditors again. And then it all started all over again. The most notable attempt to break out of this vicious circle was made by the government of Turgut Özal in the early 80s. Then, after severe inflation of more than 60% per year for several years, the country relied on exports and began large-scale privatization. The key moment was the abandonment of strict control over the lira exchange rate. Before that, the currency had already been devalued, especially notably in the late 70s. If in 1975 a dollar was worth 15 lira, then in 1985 it was already 500. In 1995 it was 43,000. And by the early 2000s, before the monetary reform, $1 was worth about 1.3 million lira. As a result of such rapid collapse of the lira, in a country with a high dependence on imports and external borrowing, inflation also reached impressive proportions. In the last 20 years of the 20th century, it has only once dropped slightly below 30% per year. But the most interesting thing in this whole story is, you know what? Despite all these shocks, between 1923 and 2003, the Turkish economy grew by an average of 6% per year, adjusted for inflation. This is even faster than most other developing countries over the same period. But people are not looking at economic reports and the number of factories built, but at prices in stores and how the contents of their wallets are changing, especially after the 90s. With hyperinflation and the almost humiliating depreciation of the national currency, society craved stability. And in the early 2000s, Recep Tayyip Erdogan promised this stability to the Turkish people. At that time, he was a young, popular mayor of Istanbul, who already had a conflict with the previous authorities. In the late 90s, he was even imprisoned for 4 months for reading religious poetry, which the court considered incitement to violence and discord. This story made him even more famous and increased his support. Another economic crisis has become an additional factor. In 2001, after the dot-com bubble burst in the United States and capital flight began, Turkey's GDP declined by almost 6%. As a result, in the 2002 elections, the Justice and Development Party, which Erdogan had just created, won a landslide victory. He started by putting the economy in order. The central bank has gained more independence, and government spending has become more balanced. This attracted foreign investors. Against the backdrop of falling interest rates in developed countries, they were again looking for more profitable and predictable markets. And Turkey looked like an excellent candidate. In 2005, in order to finally break with the memories of hyperinflation, a denomination was carried out. 6 zeros were removed from the lira at once. What used to cost $1 million was now worth 1 lira. This was not only symbolic for the Turks themselves, but it literally simplified all calculations and especially work with foreign investors. When someone wants to invest $1 billion in a project, and an amount with 15 zeros comes to his account, it is, to put it mildly, inconvenient. In general, the reforms that were understandable to the outside world, and the timing was good. The peak of globalization occurred just during these years, contributing to the beginning of sustainable economic growth in the country. From 2002 to 2007, the average annual GDP growth exceeded 7%, among the largest emerging economies. Only India and China grew faster. Due to its high dependence on external capital, Turkey has not escaped the consequences of the global financial crisis of 2008, but the economy recovered quite quickly. During the first 10 years of Erdogan's rule, industrial production grew from $40 billion to $140 billion per year. Large-scale investments in infrastructure, education and services have arrived in the country. Turkey has already begun to actively exploit its strategic position between the resource-rich regions of the East and energy-deficient Europe. It has become an important transit point. In addition, thanks to their participation in the common customs area with the European Union, Turkish manufacturers have gained free access to the huge European market. Turkish society was getting rich fast. From 2002 to 2012, GDP per capita more than tripled, from $3,500 to almost $12,000. But we must remember what all this prosperity was built on: cheap money from foreign markets and trust in Turkey's economic policy. Well, greed is also not to be ruled out. Not only foreigners, but also Turkish investors actively took out loans in dollars and euros at low rates and invested in local projects with high returns. And here was the main risk. Such a model works as long as the situation is stable and there are no serious external shocks. But it doesn't happen forever. The first alarming signals appeared in 2014, when Erdogan moved from the post of Prime Minister to the presidency. But the illusion of stability finally disappeared in 2016. The failed military coup and the repression that followed greatly reduced the flow of foreign investment. Erdogan accused external forces of organizing the conspiracy, which caused relations with the West to deteriorate, as well as with Middle Eastern partners. In 2017, a constitutional referendum was held, after which Erdogan concentrated almost all power in his hands. At the same time, he gained the right to appoint the head of the central bank, which called into question his independence. Meanwhile, the country had huge foreign currency debts. The sources of currency inflows began to dry up. The lira had fallen sharply again, and with it came a new round of inflation, as imports continue to play a key role in Turkey. In such circumstances, the classic decision of an independent central bank would be to raise interest rates. This helps cool the economy and stabilize the currency. But such a step has a political price. Loans are getting more expensive, business is slowing down, and unemployment is rising. And this is extremely unpopular. But after the coup attempt, Erdogan needed something completely different. The economy had to grow even faster in order to demonstrate that defeating the conspirators was not just a political victory, but a path to the revival of the country. In addition, maintaining high rates of economic growth was also important for his foreign policy ambitions. The idea of uniting the Turkic people under the auspices of a strong Turkey and strengthening the country's role as a representative of the Islamic world in the international arena. But it was at this point that the weakening of the lira turned from a protracted, manageable problem into an open inflationary crisis. A fall in the exchange rate of the national currency is not always catastrophic in itself. In countries with growing economies, this can even have short-term advantages. Exports become more competitive, imports become expensive, and the population switches to local goods. The mechanism is familiar. It is well illustrated by the situations in a number of countries where, after a sharp devaluation, domestic production received a boost due to increased import prices. But for production growth, access to financing is needed, preferably at low interest rates. And that's what Recep Erdogan did. In May 2018, he publicly called for lower interest rates, calling them the mother and father of all evils. However, rising inflation quickly called this approach into question. Within a few weeks, the Central Bank of Turkey sharply raised the rate from 8 to 16.5%. By mid-September, the rate reached 24% and remained at that level until July 2019, when Erdogan, using his new powers for the first time, dismissed the head of the central bank, Murat Çetinkaya. He was replaced by Murat Uysal, who obediently began to reduce the rate, returning it to almost the same level by May 2020, about 8%. But the rise in inflation continued, and he, too, soon lost his post. Naci Agbal became the new head, but he lasted less than 6 months. Under him, the central bank raised the rate 3 times, which was contrary to Erdogan's position. In the spring of 2021, Şahap Kavcıoğlu, an outspoken supporter of Erdogan's policies, was appointed head of the central bank. It was during his term that the most difficult years of the current economic crisis in Turkey fell. At the same time, the lira's exchange rate continued to fall rapidly. In the summer of 2016, less than 3 lira was given for a dollar. 3 years later, by the time the frequent change of leadership of the central bank began, the exchange rate was already about 6 lira per dollar. And by May 2023, when Erdogan was re-elected president, it was already 20 lira per dollar. After the elections, when the need to maintain the illusion of stability in the run-up to the vote disappeared, foreign exchange reserves were no longer spent on artificially restraining the exchange rate, and the lira collapsed even more. Today, a dollar is worth almost 40 lira. That is, in just 10 years, the Turkish currency has depreciated more than 10 times. And in a country where imports significantly exceed exports, and Turkey is just such a case, such a sharp devaluation inevitably leads to an acceleration of inflation. The last year when inflation was in the single digits was in 2016. Since then, it has been only double digits. And the real inflationary wave began in 2022. After the pandemic, accumulated consumer demand returned in the world. But there was not enough supply due to the consequences of lockdowns. Prices have started to rise in many countries. For Turkey, this effect was reinforced by a sharp increase in energy prices due to the outbreak of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. As the country imports over 90% of its oil and gas consumption, central banks around the world began to raise interest rates urgently. But not in Turkey. The graphs of that time clearly show how the curves diverged. Inflation was rising rapidly, while the central bank's rate remained at the same level. Why did Erdogan go against all classical ideas about how monetary policy should work? It can be assumed that the basis was not only a religious argument, that interest rates contradict Islamic norms, but also a completely rational calculation. Cheap loans stimulate the growth of production, including export. Export growth is the flow of currency into the country, which should strengthen the lira and reduce inflation. And the theory is not unfounded here. If most of the exports are based on the goods that the country produces entirely on its own, for example, oil, gas, gold, diamonds, or like China, with a full production cycle from raw materials to finished product. But Turkey does not have such a model. Over the past half-century, only on 7 occasions has it ended a year with a current account surplus, which reflects the overall balance of all foreign economic transactions. In order for the Turkish factory to produce more export product, it needs to purchase more imported materials and components. And if the currency is constantly depreciating, imports are becoming more expensive, increasing the cost. Thus, this macroeconomic experiment, in which 85 million people were actually test subjects, ended in the summer of 2023. Erdogan won the election again and, without admitting mistakes, said that the country now needs a tight monetary policy, the exact opposite of the one he has promoted over the past few years. For the first time in the history of Turkey, a woman, Hafize Gaye Erkan, was appointed head of the central bank, and Mehmet Şimşek became finance minister. Both are former top managers in international financial institutions, which has given hope to foreign investors. Perhaps now the economic course will change. However, Erkan soon left the post. The official reasons were vague. Her successor, Fatih Karahan, also represented a pragmatic school of Western economics. Prior to his appointment, he even worked at the US Federal Reserve System. The new monetary authorities began to rapidly raise the key rate. At a certain point, it exceeded 50% per annum. Now it is 46%. The rates are only higher in Zimbabwe and Venezuela. But, as practice shows, a high bid does not have an instant effect, especially in a country where the population has long been accustomed to high inflation, does not trust the national currency, and prefers to spend money immediately or transfer savings into dollars and euros rather than keeping them in unreliable lira. Inflation in Turkey began to slow down only 6 months after the start of the cycle of sharp monetary policy tightening. According to the forecast of the Central Bank of Turkey, this trend will continue, and by the end of 2025, inflation may fall below 30%, and a year later, it may become single-digit again, as it was in the mid-2010s. The most amazing thing about this whole story is that despite inflation and devaluation, the Turkish economy has continued to grow all this time. Moreover, since 2009, GDP growth has been continuous, even in the crisis year of 2020, when the whole world was faced with a pandemic. Turkey ended with symbolic but still economic growth. The secret of this result lies in a combination of several factors. The main ones are aggressive lending, which has spurred construction and industry, and cheaper labour due to the weakening of the lira. If we take the official data on the disposable incomes of Turkish households over the past 10 years and recalculate them in dollars at the current exchange rate, it turns out that in dollar terms, incomes are now lower than before the start of Erdogan's monetary experiment. At the same time, prices, even if converted into dollars, have increased significantly in Turkey in recent years. As a result, it turns out that if a manufacturer of an export product increases the salaries of its employees more slowly than the lira depreciates, it gains a competitive advantage. Due to this, it is possible to expand production and share in foreign markets. So yes, there really was GDP growth under Erdogan, but it was achieved largely due to a drop in the real standard of living. There is a lot of work in modern Turkey, but it is difficult to earn money with its help. Social media is full of complaints about rising prices and low incomes. People grab any part-time jobs, and everyone who can makes money. Even according to official statistics, 22% of Turkish teenagers aged 15 to 17 are forced to work, and often instead of studying, and not in addition to it. And so far, there have been no significant improvements. On the contrary, the authorities are actively indexing the rate of taxes, fees, and fines, which further increases the cost of living. The government is trying to collect more taxes even from those who plan to leave. Since January 2025, the fee for the right to leave the country, which all Turkish citizens are required to pay at the border, has increased to 700 lira, which is more than $20 at the current exchange rate. Turkey has a lot of trump cards that allow us to count on a serious improvement in the economic situation. First, there is a young, large, and well-educated population, whose labour is cheaper than that of their neighbours in Europe, and more productive than that of their neighbours in the East with natural resources. Secondly, there is a huge tourist potential. Even taking into account all the economic and political problems of the last decade, Turkey remains one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world. And if we add to this the fast-growing medical tourism, which is much more marginal than beach holidays, this industry can become a powerful driver of growth. In addition, Turkey is able to play a unique role as a global mediator between the global West and the global South. Ironically, Russia is increasingly being attributed to the latter today. Turkey is a member of NATO, but it does not impose sanctions against Moscow. It is culturally close to the Middle East, but at the same time, it is part of the customs union with the European Union. And as the world is increasingly divided into geopolitical blocs, those who can stay with both can earn the most. It would seem that in order to use all these opportunities, Turkey needs very little, just to demonstrate to the world a little more stability and predictability. Will it work? Will the country be able to break out of its age-old dependence on foreign investment and build a more sustainable model of economic growth? And if it can, what kind of political changes will be needed for this? Unfortunately, there are no answers to these questions today. Neither the analysts nor Erdogan himself. We can only wait and see what happens next.